Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Tom Snyder, and I'm Senior Director of Henry Schein Dental Practice Transitions. And I'm glad you're joining us for what we think is a very exciting hour with my colleague, Greg Arbach. Greg and I have over 60 plus years of experience in evaluating practices and transitioning practices. So we've seen just about everything, and hopefully you'll get some good ideas from us. This program will not be eligible for CE credits. And since we're going to be covering a lot of information, if a question comes your way, feel free to go to the chat and send that over to us via email, and we'll get back to you with an answer. So with that, let's get started. As I said, we're covering a lot of ground today. We're going to talk about planning for expansion and sale, long-term planning, growth versus stability, building value for future sale, mergers and acquisitions, and preparing for transition. So we have some key questions I want to go over with you because this audience, I'm sure, is very diverse. General practitioners, specialists, folks who've been in practice 10, 15, 20 years or more. So some of the information that we're presenting tonight will have different relevant points to you. But the bottom line is we hope that what we present will motivate you to take action if you have not taken action, or maybe even alter your plans. So one of the first things we always ask when we sit down with a doctor to review where they are, where they want to be, is how long do you plan on being a business owner? And obviously that has a big impact on timing, because if you have a short time frame, let's say 3 or 4 years, some of the ideas we're presenting may not be realistic or may not be able to give you the kind of return on investment that you'd like to get if you had to make an investment, versus some of you who have more of a long-term look in terms of maybe growing, buying multiple practices, perhaps selling out to a DSO, whatever that decision may be. So the planning time is a big deal. And also equally important is, if you do sell your practice, do you want to continue practicing? Obviously, if what we call a private sale, which is a doctor-to-doctor sale, oftentimes many doctors, usually who are older, sell their practice and then they retire after maybe 6 months to a year, unless the practice has enough of a patient base that they can stick around for a longer period. Versus many younger doctors, particularly, who really don't want to be involved in day-to-day management, are opting out to sell their businesses at an early part of their career and work for a DSO for multiple years in hope of building generational wealth given the number of years they're in practice. So that will vary based on who you are. But whether you're just in practice for a few years, in practice for 20, 30 years, you need to have a financial plan, and it should be documented. And you need to set goals. You know, we're trained in dental school on a step-by-step process, and financial planning that's what it is. It's like getting a complete physical exam where they look at everything. You look at your numbers and come up with a game plan, because that really will impact many times the planning and timing of your transition. And more importantly, we think that everybody should know what your practice is worth. For example, most of you have invested assets, and either you're looking at it on a daily basis or on a monthly basis, what's your portfolio worth? Well, a lot of doctors don't know what their practice is worth, and how can you really move forward unless you have an idea of what probably is your number one asset? So let's start talking about growth strategies. And the first one we're going to talk about is a more conventional one, in that considering an associate. Now, obviously, we'll talk a little bit about some of the metrics you need to consider when you're bringing in an associate. But one of the key questions is this associate going to be an employee because you're very busy and you just need another set of hands? Or for many doctors, particularly in their mid to later career stage, they're bringing an associate in to help solidify their transition plan. No matter what, the practice needs to be well established. And ideally, if your gross receipts are about $1 million to $1.2 million per year, you're probably in pretty good shape to add an associate. If your practice is considerably less than that in size, then that full-time associate may not be a solution, maybe a part-time associate, or in some cases, perhaps doctors cut back their schedule because, again, their reason for an associate is to solidify a transition plan. And this is particularly true in areas, small towns, rural areas, where you could lock in maybe someone who's from that community, get them in early, and lock them in for a long-term transition plan. But nonetheless, whether you're ready for one today, tomorrow, or in the future, will you need additional equipment, or do you need to make more investments in technology? How about staffing? Typically, if you're bringing an associate in, particularly a full-time associate, if your practice can support it, you're going to need additional staff. And where are those staff members coming from? How about hygienists? We all know that hygiene recruitment is a real problem in most parts of the country. So, obviously, if we're growing, we need another doctor. Do we need more hygienists? And how does that fit into the plan? What impact does that have on the size of the facility? So again, staffing is a real key issue in terms of the number of people that we need to make it work. But what is really critical is, what's the size of your office? If you have 4 treatment rooms and you want to bring an associate in, where are they going to practice? Particularly if you're a GP and have one, maybe 1.5 hygienists, per day, where is everybody going to go? We've seen situations where a doctor is really building locked, wants an associate, and they have to start fooling around with their appointment schedule, where they may cut back some time, where they may extend their hours, open 6 days a week, have staggered shifts. I've seen it all. So obviously a smaller facility is going to have a real problem. And then from that point, is there going to be any real growth? And by that, I mean, if we look at this analogy, people say, well, associates can't make money. Well, it all depends, just like in everything. It all depends on what? Well, what will that associate bring to the practice? For example, right here, you'll see additional collections of $350,000. Where is that $350,000 coming from? Is it coming from excess patients that you have already that you can't see because you're booked out 6, 8, 10 weeks in advance? Or is it because you're anxious to bring someone in and you're willing to cut your schedule back? So that's going to have an impact on whether this is a profitable investment or not. So let's just do a quick cost accounting here. Nothing sophisticated, so kind of a rudimentary approach, but at least it gives you an idea of some kind of return on investment. For example, we're going to allocate dental supplies at 6%, office supplies at 2%, lab at 10%, and that may vary whether you're high tech or not. That number might be considerably lower, or you're going to hire additional administrative or assistant costs, or maybe some miscellaneous expenses. So in this particular example, we're going to bring in $350,000. The doctor's going to work 200 days a year, $1,750 a day. And we're going to compensate that associate at 35% of their collections. So now we have expenses of $106,500 and associate comp of $122,500. And of course, we have some taxes that we have to pay as an employer. So the net profit here is about $111,000, which is 32%. However, more than likely, if your practice is truly in a growth mode where you have a very strong influx of new patients and it doesn't seem like it's going to slow down, you probably, if you can find one, are going to need another hygienist and maybe even another assistant, whether or not you're going to use expanded hygiene or not. So you can see that maybe that profit margin may not be as robust as this 32%. But nonetheless, the associate investment has to make some kind of economic benefit. Now, we have an associate who's maybe just out of dental school, out of residency training, maybe out of the military. They have expectations. And again, what do they really want? As I said at the beginning, are you recruiting an associate for simply having an employee, or do you want someone who's going to be your transition solution? But nonetheless, you should have an agreement. And one of the big issues is the non-compete, non-solicitation restrictions. And traditionally, they've been enforced in many states. We do know there are some issues now with the Federal Trade Commission about invalidating those restrictive covenants, but that's still to be determined. But nonetheless, you should have one. And if you do, it should have reasonable distance and duration. Where do you get 80% of your patients? That's a good way to kind of come up with a radius in terms of distance. Now, if you're in a metropolitan area, downtown, it might be bordered by a river and streets, like in New York City, for example. So it has to be a realistic one. And typically the duration is 1 to 2 years. If you go beyond that, if it's challenged by that associate, if they become unhappy or dissatisfied, you might have that covenant thrown out. And as I said before, each, notwithstanding where we are in the federal level, we do have local and state jurisdictions, because some states do not validate covenants whatsoever unless you're selling your business. So now I'm going to hand it over to Greg to talk about fees in your future.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. That was great. That associate conversation, I mean, it comes up a lot, and it's a great growth strategy overall, and something that I think a lot of you as practitioners are considering. And I mean, I would draw 2 points as Tom kind of wrapped up before. I mean, that non-compete, non-solicit, and the idea of protecting your practice in a transaction or transition, or just the future of your ownership, is hugely, hugely important. And that's not a question that we ask. It's a question that purchasers ask. It's a question that banks ask and other advisors ask. So I can't stress enough the importance of that written agreement and a transferability of a reasonable non-compete. The other item to talk about is just that cost component of what of bringing in an associate, and making sure and going through a real assessment to make sure that there is a growth strategy there, and that in the short term, though, your practice can support it. I mean, are you taking money out of your pocket to add an associate to a practice, or is there a real growth and essentially what I've called in the past a phantom practice out there for the new practitioner to come in and just kind of suck into the practice and really get running really quickly? But when we're talking about costs overall, every one of your practices obviously has a set overhead. And so when we talk about the idea of maybe getting to 32% margin on an associate, which, again, we acknowledge that could be pretty rosy, but, let's look at the bigger picture. Every one of your practices, again, has an overhead. And if you're looking at, on average, for the entire country, a practice doing $1 million, this is what those overhead and kind of where those key metrics land for different points of your practice overall. So you can see across the board, we have variability in what profit margin may be. Clearly, I mean, on average, a general practice is running somewhere in the 40% range for $1 million office. It can do a little bit better. We can see a little bit worse as well. But honestly, if we see $1 million office, we want to see profit margin somewhere in the 55 to 60% range. That's showing a real strong quality practice overall. As you can see, and why some specialists are actually flourishing over time. I mean, if you're an endo or endodontist, or if you're in surgical work, your profit margin is significantly higher. And if you look over the scope of why that may be, it's pretty clear. Whether it be lab expenses, but more so wages and labor. For a practice that does not have hygienists in the practice, honestly, again, the profit margin is going to be a little bit higher, which you can basically see, because in GPs and pediatric offices and perio, we have a pretty close range as far as what profit margin is. And again, a lot of that ties back to the use of hygienists and the costs of additional staffing overall, because for the most part, the rest of your practice operating overhead, which we're going to talk about later, is pretty fixed. So what can you do, though? I mean, obviously, you can go and control your overhead to some extent. And one of those conversations that we like to have with doctors a lot is obviously control your expenses, but don't over control your expenses, because your staff or whomever is doing different ordering or different work in your practice, they don't necessarily want to feel micromanaged to the point that you're looking at pennies. So pennies are important. Pennies do add up, but you only want to go so far. You do have a lot of control over other things, though. And one of those is your fee structure. And your fee structure can be a huge determinant in what your overhead percentage may be. Again, as I mentioned, your overhead is relatively fixed in a practice, but your fees are not overall. And especially something that while your overhead will increase, your fees should be increasing too. So let's look at the cost of dentistry itself. We're going to use a D2740, just a regular crown overall. the fee on a national average, this is the 70th percentile. So this is not the highest percentile, it's not the lowest. The 70th percentile on national averages and national fee surveying is about $1,500 or just $1,547 for full UCR. This is not discounted at all. We're going to say and allocate to you an hour and 3/4 to get that crown done. An hour for the prep and 3/4 of an hour for cementation. We're going to apply the costs of doing business. So you're going to have a lab cost, and we think $150 on average for the country is a pretty solid crown. Supplies are going to run you about $95 for that crown. The fixed expenses, because you have everything else that goes in, and we're boiling all of that down to a single crown, roughly $525 an hour, which is pretty good for an average for the country. And we're going to apply that towards the 1.75 hours that it took you to do the work. So that's about $919 for that single crown. So if we take the $1,547, subtract out your expenses of $919, you have a pre-tax earnings of $378. Earnings per hour, $216. I mean, that's not too bad, right? $216 to do the work, that's not bad. But where we're going to go now is to look at what the discounting looks like. So this is 90%. So at 90% of UCR, your fee is now just under $1,400. Your total time to do that did not change. You didn't get to do it 10% faster because you're getting 10% less. Your lab, you don't have a different lab for that different discount. Your supplies are the same because you're taking it off the same shelf, and your fixed expenses run in the office as they do. And that's including your staff. So pre-tax earning on that crown is now $223, which gets you down to $127 per hour. Again, not too bad. But we're going to go one more step. And I'm only going to go one more step. We're going to look at 80% UCR. So this is now just over $1,200 for the fee for what you've taken in. Still is taking you an hour and 3/4. Same expenses overall for $919 plus lab and supplies. So your pre-tax earnings now on that is $69. Your earnings per hour is just under $40 per hour. And there is an asterisk on this, and we say that because if you're putting it in perspective, a hygienist paid $300 per day, which is relatively inexpensive right now, is making $37.50 an hour, or just about the same as you are on that one discounted crown. Now, this discounted crown could be just about anything. This discounted could be a PPO fee. It could be a friends and family fee. But as you know, we're only taking off 20%. This is not a significant discount overall, and probably something that you would give to a family or friend. But just keep in mind, whatever that discount is, your expenses don't change, but your bottom line take home does. And so when we talk about a percentage of overhead, the percentage of overhead on your 80% UCR crown is significantly higher than it is on the 100% UCR crown. So your fees can drive your overhead. Let's take this one step further. Let's look at the one discounted crown per day. So we're talking about the 1547 UCR versus the 20% discount at 1238. So if we take your UCR 4 days per week, because we assume you're only going to work 4 days a week, which most of you do, at 1547 per day, again, we're doing one discounted crown per day, that's about $6,000 per week. The 6,200 or so times 45 weeks is $278,000 per year. Or 50 weeks, if you work the full 50 weeks, is $309,000 per year. Compare that to the discount, the 20% off. Now we're getting just under $5,000 per week. And at 45 weeks a year, that's $222,000. And at 50 weeks a year, it's just under $250,000. So extrapolating that and just putting the two next to each other, at a 45-week rate, $278,000 minus the $222,000 is a $55,000 difference. So your 20% off for that one crown per day is resulting in about $55,000 a year. Now, we're not talking a lot about value on this phone call, on this webinar. We're not talking a lot about value. We're not getting into value, but we're going to show you what value is on that $55,000, and we're going to capitalize it at 20%. You can trust me at this point, 20% is a good capitalization rate. This is a quality practice overall. It's operating efficiently overall. And so this capitalization rate is pretty low. So the total loss in value, though, is almost $300,000. What we do is we take the 55,620 and divide that by 20%. That's how we deal with the capitalization rate and getting it into value. And it ends up being $278,000 of lost value in your practice with one discounted crown per day. If we put that into a 50-week, it's 310,000 minus the 247 is about $62,000 per year. Again, we're going to capitalize that at 20%. So it's $309,000 lost value by one discounted crown over a 50-week year per day. That's a significant amount of money. And that's why we wanted to put that into perspective for you and just to get a feeling for where that kind of shakes out. So why is this really important? The reality is all of our costs are going up every year, whether it be supply costs, and we know who we work for, but supply costs go up every year. Lab fees, your lab fee is going up every single year. Rent, facility costs, employee costs, everything is going up, including your at-home costs, because everything from groceries to utilities to everything you need at home goes up every year. I've got 3 kids myself. You're going to see a picture of them a little bit later, but their costs obviously are going up every single year as they get older, and those don't change. And so for you, that's not changing either. Beyond that, though, your retirement needs are changing year over year, and they're only going up. We're going to go through a table in just a little bit to kind of illustrate that. But if you're not controlling where your fees are, if you're not spending the time to increase your fees, you're not keeping up with where things are and where everything else is going. And in that case, you're falling behind. So in looking at this another way, let's look at the cost of not increasing your fees. So we looked at the cost of discounting your fees and your net loss and potentially discounting fees. But what if you just don't increase your fees? And again, we just went through a list of all of the things that go up every single year, and that was not even exhaustive. But if we look at an $800,000 practice with a 3% increase every year for 5 years, you can see on the left the annual growth going from 800 up 3% to 824, up again to 848, 874, 900, and 927. So in the second column, you can see the annual increase year over year. Now, again, it's not stable. It's not exactly the same at $24,000 because we have the ability to compound that growth. So we did growth on the first year plus the growth, and we've added and added and added, and it eventually gets to be larger. On the far column, though, we look at the increase from year 0. So what is it from the year that we started? So we went $24,000 the first year, then we doubled it to 48. Then all of a sudden we're $74,000 more, $100,000 more, and $127,000 more. At the end of those 5 years, we have not just increased the practice $127,000, we've increased it $373,000 because that was a growth upon growth upon growth upon growth. Mind you, we are not changing anything in this model. This is an assumption that you are doing exactly the same dentistry as you did it year over year, year over year. We didn't do anything but change your fees. So again, every day you did the same procedures on the same patients for 5 years, and all we did was increase your fees. And your net increase in your pocket is $373. Again, that's not value, that's cash in your pocket. So that's a big deal if you decide that you're not increasing your fees. So we look at this another way. Let's just say you took that annual increase, just that annual increase, and you decided to invest that. Because in a lot of cases, if you're not putting money into retirement, this is a very easy way to do that, right? Because we're just going to put the variable different year over year. Now, we already showed that in year 5, you're going to take home actually more than the $27,000, right? You're taking home $127,000 more in year 5 than you did at year 0. But we're only going to take the $27,000 difference year over year. That added discretionary cash to you is $127,000. If we put that into investment and we invest it over time, that could be even $500,000 of cash that you invested that you get value out of that will never be recovered if you don't do that. So this is one of those things, again, it's something that's important to do year over year, but it's important to start early as well and putting money away early because you get the value out of the compounding of your investment. We talked a lot of different things. We talked about covering your overhead. We've talked about cash in your pocket. We've talked about investing. We've talked about value. But all of them go up if you're in control of what you're discounting in your fees and what you're increasing in your fees year over year. So then it becomes a question of, well, what do you need? So this is a simple table, and I'm going to tell you it's wrong. It's just wrong. All of these change, but at least it gets you in a ballpark of understanding where we are. So on the left-hand side, you can see the monthly after-tax living expenses. So this is how much you're spending essentially every month after taxes and what's available. On the right-hand side, this is the amount that you're going to need at age 65, assuming 3% inflation, to retire and actually have the amount of money on the left. I'm going to look at this column, the $20,000, because in most cases, our practitioners are making somewhere in the $240,000 range per year. And so this is assuming that is after taxes. To do that, you need roughly $6.5 million invested to get you through retirement. So if you need a target, there's a target. If you want a little bit more, if you want 360 a year, you need closer to 10 million. If you're frugal and you can live on 120 a year, obviously you need about 3.2 million. But this is where you're targeting. This is also tying again back to your fees and back to investing that difference even year over year, or just funding enough to get your retirement settled. Because this is the money that you're going to live on once your career has ended, once your wet finger dentistry career has ended. This is potentially the money that you're living on. So we want to make sure that there's sufficient out there to do that. We have ways to help you with all of this. It's not just saying go out and do 3% increases per year. One of these great ways to do this is the Henry Schein practice analysis. These are huge opportunities for revenue enhancement. So fee balancing is one of those things that we just talked about. It's looking at your fees, seeing where you can increase them, see where they may be off, they may be low. Where can you balance your fees to get them right? But this report does significantly more than that. It's also looking at how you're utilizing radiography throughout the year, where there's opportunities in hygiene, including recall and recare, what you're doing with periodontal therapy in your practices, as well as what you're referring out. All of this also includes someone's going to sit and go through that document with you and give you ways to get to where you want to go. We have a whole host of services outside of just our transitions team within the company, and we're happy to here to help you. This is one of those that's a door opener. It's incredibly inexpensive and something that we suggest to every one of our practitioners, whether you're doing evaluation with us or you're just starting a career, something to do this and repeat this. This is available from your Henry Schein dental representative, your field sales consultant, your FSC. They're the ones selling you supplies in your practices. They can help you with that. And again, you're going to get a return on investment on this almost immediately. And that investment only grows over time. Because again, we're not just doing this once, we're doing it year over year over year, as far as when you add to your practice in this way. And so it's just a huge benefit to you overall, both in your cash flow, your overhead percentage, your value at the end of the day, and then what you're able to put into retirement. So let's talk about value growth though as well, because we talked about associates, we talked about where there's value in your fees, but there's also value in growing your practice. So this is what I like to look at. This is kind of a startup model for our practice. So the red line is a little bit backwards. The red line, we're looking at collections. The blue line, we're looking at expenses in your office. And as I mentioned before, expenses in your dental practices are generally fixed. That's why this curves up and kind of levels out. And it will level out for a significant amount of time, where then it will potentially step up slightly as you need to add more staff. But most of the expenses to run your office are going to be fixed. It's just coming with opening the door. So if you were to start up a practice with the left hand being 0, time 0, and income 0, and in those cases, we know this is a little bit off because you probably have a practice note, you have rent, you have something that's going to start at day 0, but we're just going to start everything at 0. But for this first period of time, you're running at a loss. You may be seeing patients, you may be doing something, but you're running at a net loss. At this point of intersection, this green arrow, this is where you've made $1. Congratulations, you made $1. Now, we as human beings, we typically take that $1 and we post it on the wall and save it there. So maybe you took a step back and we're back to even, but then you're going to make $1 after that. but this is where you're actually going to make your first dollar. So we have a huge success day. That's fantastic. Typically speaking, this is anywhere from 6 months to 2.5 years down the road from a startup. And generally speaking, it's somewhere in the $250,000 range in collections, and potentially could be a little bit higher depending on where you're living and the way that you're operating your practice. So this is, again, when you start making the dollar. As we grow and your collections continue to grow and your expenses even out, we get into this area that I like to call the area of optimum benefit. What's happening is you've accelerated the practice and you're starting to really take hold of what your collections and what your net income is off of those collections. So you're starting to see, as you do $1, $10, $100, $1,000 more in production, that's more of that is dropping to the bottom line and you're really reaping the benefits. So we're typically talking a practice that's doing maybe on the 500 range, typically somewhere between $600,000 to $800,000 is when you start to get to this tipping point where you're really making money in a practice. And this is, like I said, where we talk about it being optimum benefit. As we step further, though, this is where we'd like you to be. This is area of optimum practice. So this is getting into the over $800,000 in collections range. And it could go, depending on you as a practitioner, where you are located, what the patient base is, anywhere from $1.2 million to $1.5 million. I've seen it as high as $1.8 million. But the goal in being in that range, anywhere that 800,000 plus to say the $1.2 million, $1.5 million range, is that you've really started to make money. You've started to make money in the point that every dollar that's coming in, you're only paying out lab and supplies because you've covered your overhead of the practice. So you're really taking home, in some cases, 90% of every dollar that you bring into the practice. This is when your overhead starts getting squished as far as percentage goes, and where we can get to the point of your $1 million office operating and being at something like 60%, 55%, in some cases even 50% overhead overall. So we really accelerated where it goes. We've maximized what we have as far as collections goes. We've maximized the efficiency of the practice overall, and we're able to increase our take home overall by capitalizing on this built-in practice and practice operation. So that's the area of optimum practice where we'd really like you to be. This is, again, where net income is highest and where value is really highest. So how do we get there faster? Let's say you're a practice already operating. So if you're a $600,000 collecting practice before, we're going to look at some kind of merger. Let's say that there's a practice nearby and you have the opportunity to take in that practice and merge it into yours. Now, there are a lot of things that need to be considered in doing this, including the makeup of the practice, where the patients are coming from. And by makeup, I'm talking about payer mix, so fee-for-service, PPO, HMO, Medicaid, what's the mix of that practice? But also, what are the procedures that are being done? Are they compatible with your practice? Is your staff compatible with your practice? Assuming all being equal, assuming that this is all the case, let's look at your $600,000 practice, and we have the opportunity to merge in a $300,000 practice. So before merge, we're going to say your collections are $600,000. You're running a reasonable overhead at $378,000, so your total net income is $222,000. We're going to look at two scenarios. Scenario one is that 75% of that $300,000 makes it into your practice. Scenario two, only 50% of that practice makes it into your practice. Now, there are a lot of things that we can do to help increase that percentage. But again, we're going to model this out and we're going to look at a worst case scenario that only 50% of the patients make it to your practice. So in the two scenarios, your collections go up either $825, adding $225,000, or just to $750 by adding $150. Your overhead is going to remain stable because I'm going to be in the assumption that you're going from $600,000 to somewhere in the $750,000 to $850,000 range. Again, we talked about overhead already being fixed, so we're capitalizing on what's already there. Excuse me. So you have a moderate increase, so you're still going to run at 61%. So you have a total net income at 39% or $321,000 in scenario one, and just under $293,000 in scenario two. So there's a cost to buying this practice though. Almost always someone's going to get financing for this. So let's look at a picture here of what it looks like when we actually finance that out. So I have three different scenarios here, and I'm going to do something. We're going to breeze through this. But you can see we've looked at minus debt service of 30%. So let's say you paid $100,000 for that practice, minus debt service of 60%. So you paid $200,000 for that office. Or at the end of the day, the very bottom, minus debt service of 100%. So we're going to assume you've paid $300,000 to earn $300,000. Now, there's a lot out there, written and otherwise, about how much you should pay for a merger practice. And there are a lot of different modalities about how to do that and how it actually gets done and what you should pay. My point here is, let's assume you paid $300,000 for $300,000. What does that look like? So at the end of the day, we have a debt service of about $69,000. We have a net income, it's about $31,000. And then we have a total net benefit. So what did you make out of doing that acquisition? Because again, it's not just net income, but it's net income after paying for it. And what we can see in the bigger picture here is we went from $222,000 up front, and we go to the far right, far low corner. So the worst case scenario, we still made a positive benefit of $1,735. We paid 100% of collections and only got half of the practice to come over. And in that case, we still earned over $1,700. We didn't go negative. We didn't even break even. We did better than that. So this is the point. You can pay for this. Charts are not just worth $100 per chart. And why is that? The reality is that this is an annuity. So in this case, you may have made $1,700 the first year. But even if you didn't do anything different, it's $1,700 every single year. The reality, though, is you're probably going to do the better in the practice. You're going to make it more efficient. You're going to do more procedures on those patients. Otherwise, you wouldn't necessarily be bringing them in. So that $1,700 is almost a baseline. But again, it's not a baseline negative. It's a baseline positive over zero, saying that you can do this. Mergers are my favorite thing overall in transitions. If you have the opportunity, as I can show you in the numbers, it's worthwhile to pay whatever it takes to get that merger and that patient base into your practice, provided that it's a match. Philosophies between you as practitioners, the patient mix, the payer mix. Again, bringing a PPO office into your fee-for-service office may not work very well, but if it's fee-for-service into fee-for-service, or fee-for-service PPO into your fee-for-service PPO, then you have a great match. Ideally, we have a hygienist that will come over and or the doctor practitioner. We can make this work, and we can make it hugely financially beneficial to you overall. So the other component about growth and going forward and looking at where you are with your practice is technology and investments in your practice. So just to be honest, the way that we look at equipment value in a transition is almost zero. The reality is you probably depreciated that equipment, and therefore there's just nothing left over in tangible value to be transitioning. A purchaser will get the opportunity to reestablish a basis for tax purposes, but the value of that used equipment in the transaction doesn't typically value very high. Now, for you as an owner who's transitioning out, you want most of the transactional value to be put into goodwill anyway. So that's a benefit to you. But again, equipment value is almost zero. So we do acknowledge that. Technology also does not always help to support a higher price. I'm sorry, technology doesn't support value, but technology can support a higher price. So a purchaser coming in sees that you've invested in technology, will see that you made that investment, you didn't leave it up to them, and they've got something ready to go. Investing, though, takes careful thought, and it's something that we like to talk about. And there's the various levels of obviously going digital, going paperless, and then getting into additional technology over that. So when we talk about where you are from potential transition and what investments you're going to make, if you're in the short term, the 0 to 2 years, we really want you to talk to us. Let's figure this out and figure out what the best path is going to be. Generally speaking, we're probably going to tell you to do nothing. There's not a lot that can be done in the short term to get that investment back to you at the end of the day. So we don't want that to happen, and we want to make sure you maximize your value, but also make sure you get your investment back. So in a lot of cases, we may tell you there's not a lot to do. We may look, though, at digital updates, software updates, especially if there's an end of life of software. You investing in doing that and getting it in place can be very important for a purchaser who's looking at the value of your practice. You want to also potentially review the aesthetics of the office. Paint, floors, typically pretty inexpensive. I've gone into offices where there still is carpet in the operatories. And to be honest, that's the first thing I want someone to do. And I don't care in a lot of cases how close we are to transition. If we can get the carpet out of the operatories and the sterilization areas, we're in a much better place. So that's something to do. There's very inexpensive luxury vinyl opportunities to put in there. Your hand pieces, your instruments will be safe from being dropped on them. They're soft and they look very professional. So there's some inexpensive, easy aesthetics that can be done in practices. If you're 2 to 5 years from transition, again, we want to look and hopefully work with you. We do want to do probably a stronger practice review. Strongly consider, if you're not already, going paperless. If you've got computers at the front desk and the operatories, that's good. But if we can get you to paperless, that's one less step for a purchaser to take care of. Consider updated technology, especially something that's relatively inexpensive. Digital scanners, digital painter X, that's almost getting to full standard of care. And so you investing in that and having that ready to go is important. And there's lots of technologies that you can be talked through and understand what's going to be valuable to you in practice, because we want you to use it. We want you to embrace it. We want your staff to embrace it. So it's not just an investment for the investment, but it's something you're going to take out of the practice as far as your daily use as well. So consider it and get some expert advice as far as that goes. But again, we're not talking about high ticket necessarily expenses. And again, aesthetics, strongly review them. Maybe look a little bit further than just paint and flooring. Maybe it's for the full office. Maybe it's cabinetry. Maybe it's the countertops that you have. Really look closer at those overall. 5 to 10 years out and 10 years plus, we've got much more time to actually do something. So you need to be digital 5 to 10 years. That's sensors and digital pan, if not CVCT. Definitely you need to be transitioning to paperless and getting your computers up to date. And then we want to look at other mainstream and larger technologies to see, again, if they apply to you in practice, if they're going to be useful to you in practice, and how we're going to be able to leverage those down the road. 10 plus years, again, digital, no question. You have to continue to invest in computers. Don't have a server that is 10 years old at the point of transaction. Keep those up to date so that they're running well. Strongly consider other technologies in your practice. Stay up to date, be on the cutting edge as best you can. And then also look at your other assets in your practice. How long do they have to go? And do you need to start replacing them? Because purchasers see these things. There is an aesthetic that goes with an older chair, older cabinetry, older dental units. If the logos and everything is rubbed off, they may be great. You may have serviced them yourself. We obviously have great service techs and we can keep things running very well, but a purchaser is going to start questioning the continued lifespan on them. So reviewing those and considering those replacements sooner or later can really help you in value. Some other things that we talk about as you're looking towards transaction, especially in the near term, do not cut back your hours and pay the same. Okay, that's essentially giving your staff a pay raise that a purchaser may not be able to support going forward. So consider that, especially when they might want to go from the 3 days a week that you've cut back to the 4 days a week. 5 days to 4 days, I'm less concerned about. 4 days to 3 days or 2.5 days, that becomes a concern. Also, if you're in your last year, if you're thinking about transitioning now, please don't cut your hours down. Keep everything as stable as possible. We would like you to make sure you're reducing hygiene cancellations. So just as we were talking about reduced fees, hygiene cancellations become zeros on your schedule. So if we look at one cancellation in your hygiene department per day, let's assume that's $165 plus half of an exam. We're going to assume that you're going to do one exam a year. So we're going to run that at $96. Your 4-day a week cost on that is $621 per appointment, or about $1,000 per week. Again, over 45 weeks, that's about $47,000 per year. Over 50 weeks, that's $52,000 per year. That's lost revenue with the expense, because you paid your hygienist to be there almost always. You've lost that revenue every day. And when you take that over the course of the year, that's a significant amount of money. If nothing else, that's money that we're talking about you putting into your retirement fund letting run and helping you get to that $6.5 million number that we're trying to target to get you sufficient money to retire at age 65. So look at your hygiene cancellations, get quick call lists, figure out how to plug those holes, and keep your hygienist busy. Another thing, again, as we've talked about, clean up clutter, consider a cosmetic upfit, the new operatory maybe if necessary, especially if you're talking about the associate. You need to make sure that you have more than 4, really 5. We like you to have 6 to 8 operatories at minimum to accommodate an associate, because it's not just 2 doctors, it's potentially 2 associates per doctor. So that's 2 operatories for each doctor. So that's 4 operatories. Plus, if you each have 2 hygienists, because you built a very large practice at that point, that's 4 more operatories. That's 8 total operatories. Can you get by on 6? We've definitely seen it. 6 is a minimum though, because again, if you break that down, somebody is giving up an operatory somewhere, or you're dealing with creative scheduling. So consider that, especially when you're talking about associates, but consider that also as you're growing going forward. And as always, continue marketing the new patients, because it's just very important that you're keeping that new patient flow. We are never not seeing new patients in a practice. That is the death knell of a practice. Please spend a lot of time continuing to keep patients coming in the door. Just as a perspective, a majority of practice sales nationally are somewhere between 60 and 90% of prior year's gross revenues. We do have practices that sell for less. We do have practices that sell for more. This is not evaluation, it's just giving some perspective. If you want to be closer to that 90%, all of these things that we've talked about, your fees, your payer mix, your overhead, your technology, your aesthetics, all of this combined together to get you to value and get you to price. Those are not necessarily the same thing, but they can be. And the way that you keep that up is keeping your practice up to date, whether it be in your operations, your financials, or just the fixed assets of your practice. At this point, Tom, I think let's turn it back over. Let's talk about, because there's that other growth strategy of bringing in a partner. And I think that's where you were kind of getting to also with the associate opportunity. So let's talk about partnerships for a minute.
Thanks, Greg. That was really great information, very insightful. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit. And we're going to talk about partnerships. I've been consulting with dentists probably close to 30 years on partnerships, various types of partnerships. Earlier, we talked about associates, bringing an associate in for a transition plan, and that's a buy-in partnership. But I want to address a different type of partnership, kind of spinning off what Greg mentioned before with a merger. But we're looking at it just a bit differently relative to the size. Let's assume we have 2 practices, one doing about 1.5, the other one doing about 1.2 million. Doctors are in their late 30s, early 40s. They see a vision together. They want to work together. They want to grow. They may even want to own multiple offices and eventually sell to a corporate partner. But there's a lot of things we need to look at in this, because I have seen some that just don't work out too well. And of course, if we have that type of a scenario, is it the plan for the partners to be equal? And what about the age? Typically, with mergers that I'm referencing right now, the doctors are usually within a few years of each other, maybe knew each other in dental school, military service, whatever, obviously in the same community. And typically what happens is one of the doctors doesn't own the building, has a lease, and can't grow, can't expand, knows the other doctor who owns a building, for example, has capacity, and they want to come together, which is great. However, one of the things that I've seen, even kind of train wreck this partnership from even starting out, is relative values. For example, what if one practice is 1.2, one is 1.5, we value those practices. What if there is a different value? And there could well be. Why? Well, it could relate to the procedure mix. The payer mix, is the one practice, as Greg mentioned before in his analogy of the merger in, a PPO practice, some Medicaid, HMO thrown in, or other as a traditional fee for service practice. So we have to really deal with that because that might have some major ramifications, even getting this new partnership started of these two doctors. But where I've seen issues develop, where pride gets in the way, is if, the one doctor's practice is considerably worth more than the other. Well, obviously, someone owes some money to the other doctor. How will that be financed? Is it going to be bank finance? Is there a requirement for liquidity? Or can it be internally financed in the partnership agreement? So these things, before everybody really starts, moving furniture around or equipment, we need to deal with these things up front, because sometimes, in my experience, we haven't gotten very far. However, let's be positive and assume everything is solved. Well, now Dr. A has some tangible assets that aren't going to be transferred over, and how are they going to be disposed? Who keeps the sale of those assets? How about management software? Not as common a problem as it was years ago, but if we have dissimilar software programs, we want to only have one. What does that all mean? So we have to deal with that for sure. Where I've seen some real issues in these types of partnerships is relating to staffing. Because if we're bringing in large size practices with full staff, there could be some economies of scale. So some positions could be eliminated. Who's going to be eliminated? Who makes those decisions? What if we can't come to agreement on the elimination of that position? That's a roadblock. How about the leadership of the team? Not the doctors, but let's assume we have two strong office managers. Who becomes the number one office manager? Does the other person get demoted? Does that person leave because they're upset they can't be the top boss anymore? So those things have to be really negotiated. And where sometimes it gets very tricky is where we have very dissimilar fringe benefit packages, notwithstanding the type of health insurance, how much their Dr. A is paying for, and how much Dr. B is paying. Do the staff contribute to it, or is it all paid for by the practice? That has to be dealt with. Another significant point could be a pension plan. What if one doctor has a more of a money purchase pension plan, putting a lot of money away, staff are getting a nice piece. The other doctor may have a simple IRA. How do we deal with that? They have to be dealt with. How about time off? One doctor gives more vacation time than the other. What's it going to be like in a merged situation? So, in addition to all the things that need to be done in a partnership, and obviously we could spend an hour talking about partnership agreements and how they're compensated. But I think if you're looking at a growth strategy where you've got two very strong practices that know that A plus B equals C, and then thereafter maybe D, E, and F, we've got to deal with some of these things at the outset to make sure we can get to that kind of a platform. Then finally, depending on the age, and if the age is fairly similar, how is this going to occur as far as an exit strategy? Is one doctor more financially capable of retiring early? At what age? How do we deal with that? And if that person leaves before the other person, how do we deal with the buyout of that partner? Or if they're relatively the same, is your strategy to go to someone bigger than you and just cash out and sell to that larger entity? So these are things that are very important, that you need to have these basic conversations, because there's a lot of hidden things in these relationships that need to be discovered and really, really agreed to. So in kind of winding down with our presentation today, as you recall, I talked about some key questions that need to be considered for transition planning. But we're adding a very important one, and that is, do you have an emergency exit strategy? What happens if something happens to you? How is the practice disposed? And Greg and I have been in this business long enough to see some very tragic situations occur, where it's not just a sudden death, but it could be a terminal illness. It could be something, mental capacity. It could be very debilitating. So it really means a lot to have some type of a planned exit strategy, as we've talked about. But that planned exit strategy really is what happens if you're no longer around. And we've tried to sell practices where the doctor has passed away. And what we learned that only 30% of practices will sell within 90 days of death. Why? Depending on where they're located, how the staffing works, and if there's any people coming in to help out, those practices aren't worth that much. And the longer it stays closed, that percentage of opportunity decreases dramatically. So it's almost non-sellable. So the bottom line is, if something were to happen, you need to have a plan. And what is that plan? Well, first of all, you need to develop, or you should have a will, and it should be updated. There should be a codicil in the will, which will give instructions for the disposition of your practice relating to the letter of instructions. Now, you can see this lovely family. That's the Auerbach family, and beautiful, beautiful family. And he wanted to share that with you.
We've been supporting the Hey, we've been supporting the tooth fairy. The one
right.
The one on the top. She's lost a couple of those teeth already.
Oh,
so.
she did. Okay. Great pictures. And of course, with the letter of instruction is a practice valuation. And in all seriousness, though, the letter of instruction and evaluation are so important, particularly if you're a solo practitioner, because there's no one else if you're not there. If you're in a group, there are issues that should be dealt with, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But particularly if you're a solo practitioner, I don't care how old you are, you should have a letter of instruction with the practice valuation done. Just recently, we heard of a young dentist, 35 years old, who passed away suddenly. So it's not older doctors. It could be mid-career. We've seen doctors, traffic accidents, skiing mishaps, surfing, you name it, things happen. That's life. So let's get a plan together. And one of the things that we're proud and we support, and I've written about it in numerous articles, I'm sure Greg has as well, and even talked about it in webinars and things, is developing a letter of instructions. And fortunately, we've put together one for you. So you can access that by going to www.henryshinedpt.com/whatif, or get a QR code too, so you can get this document, download it. It's an interactive PDF, and you can fill it out. And who should get this document? Well, obviously, a lot of people should. Your spouse or partner definitely should. Your CPA, if you have a financial planner who's not a CPA, an additional person that is, they should get a copy. If you have an attorney, they should have a copy. If you have a strong relationship with your field sales consultant or dental representative, they should get a copy. And if you've been working with a transition company, maybe had valuations done before, they should get a copy. Because what happens if something happens to you, almost immediately a plan is executed, because we don't want to practice sitting on the sidelines. And the worst thing for us to do is contact the spouse of a deceased doctor and try to work something out. That's just not appropriate. We don't like to do that. We don't want to do that. But we've got to do everything we can to sell that practice as quickly as possible. So obviously, this is one thing that Greg and I feel is a real takeaway for you today, to make sure that if you don't have it, implement an emergency exit strategy, get that PDF from our website, and get a plan together. Obviously, if you are in a partnership, it's a good idea to review your buy-sell agreements, because I've seen situations where, for example, if there's a buyout on insurance where insurance hasn't been updated, and now all of a sudden one of the partners owes real cash for the deceased partner or disabled partner, they could have maybe had that funded if they were more current with that. Obviously, having a transition consultant is really important. So leases, for example, what's in those leases and what's the term of the lease? Because if you're no longer there, if you have 8 years left, that landlord still wants their money. So it's all about using this document to marshal your resources, get your people together, and make a good plan.
And just, there's no charge for that either, right? I mean, we are giving that to you. We think it's that important for you to have. We think a practice valuation goes hand in hand with it, and obviously that is not complimentary, but this document itself is, and it's something that, along with the valuation, should be kept up to date year over year get it updated, make sure that the proper information is there. But again, please click through that. We're giving that to you for no cost.
That's right. We're really we've been pushing this for many, many years, and we're really sincere about it. It needs to get done. We also have some other resources. We have a dental practice valuations ebook that's been recently released, and you can get that. There's the QR code, and that'll go into great detail about how practices are valued, what are things that really affect negatively or positively the value of a practice. Also, this webinar series, as others that have been done over the last few years, you can find many webinar topics on our website, and you can download the webinars at your leisure and look at them 1 or 2, 3 times, whatever you'd like. We have about 12 or 15, I believe, on the site right now, going back to, I think, 2022 or 23. So you can get some good information about things that we firmly believe in, and more information than we were able to provide you in the short time today. So it has been my pleasure to work with my colleague, Greg. You did a super job, Greg. It was fun to be with you. We worked this out. We're trying to figure out what's something that, at least at the end of this hour, people say, I got a pearl. In my years of public speaking, all I care about is I want one pearl of wisdom that will maybe motivate you, that you can take back to your office and to your family and implement it tomorrow. So again, many thanks for joining us, and really wish you all the best luck in the coming years to our attendees. Greg, finish it up, friend.
No, I was going to say, thank you all for attending. I mean, obviously we have a lot of information. Now, our goal is to invest in you as practitioners to make your practices better. Again, we want to see you taking home more money now, taking it home in for retirement, taking it home in value, doing everything to make your practice life, your staff life, your family life, your personal life better. That is the goal that we're talking about here. And then, like I said, as Tom wrapped up at the end, in the case that something does go wrong, that your team is around you to help take care of your family, your estate, your practice. Again, that's staff and patients to get you to the right place. So Tom, you were great. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for participating, and we'll see you all again soon.